Aristophanes' Lysistrata, a revision summary. So I'm just going to basically talk through the text and annotate it with the colour scheme. Pink is for contextual annotation, so political, historical context. Blue is for types of humour. Purple is for language and translation issues, and green is for any other points. So it begins with the setting outside the houses of Lysistrata and Calanice. Lysistrata is annoyed that no other women have shown up yet. She says that if there had been a celebration for Bacchus, Pan, or Aphrodite, it'd be very busy. Bacchus is also Dionysus, the god of alcohol, amongst other things, and Pan or Aphrodite are both goddesses of sex, or gods and goddesses of sex. So this is characterising the women as sex-aholics and alcoholics. Calanice arrives and they discuss womankind. All our husbands think we're such clever villains. Well, aren't we? This is stereotyping the women as villains. Lysistrata says that she has called the meeting for a very important reason. Calanice says that they will come, but it's hard for a wife to leave the house. And this tells us about the daily life of a woman in ancient Greece. Calanice asks why Lysistrata has called them. They refer to the issue as big and meaty. This is vulgar humour, verbal humour, and double entendre. Lysistrata says, "We women have the salvation of all Greece in our hands." Now this is referring to the entirety of Greece, which wasn't just one state until the Byzantine age. So at the moment Greece is in separate polis, which were city-states, and they were all different nationalities essentially, and she wants to unite them. Calanice says that the women can't achieve this because they just sit at home looking pretty and wearing saffron gowns. So this is obviously written by men, acted by men, in a completely patriarchal society, so this is what the men think women do, not necessarily what they actually did, obviously. Lysistrata says that it is these sexual things, like the gowns, which they will use to stop the war. Lysistrata says that women are Athenian, and so can always be relied on to be late. This is a reference to the past year when the Athenian naval forces had been too late to stop allied cities from revolting. Marini and several other women arrive on stage, followed by Lampito and the other Spartans. Lampito is the epitome of character-based humour. She is like a very masculine woman. Everything about her is supposed to be funny. All of the female Spartans have their garments slit at the side so that they can fight or be active. And this shows the contrast between the Spartan and Athenian culture. Whilst the Athenians were very patriarchal and prioritised thoughts and learning and politics, the Spartans were still patriarchal, but had they wanted their women to have the same education as boys and to be able to fight if it was necessary. So there was a bit more. This is from an obviously Athenian perspective, characterising the women as quite manly in Sparta. They talk about Lampito as if she were a man, which is stereotyping the Spartan woman. They then feel Lampito's buttocks and breasts. They then all comment on the Boeotian Ismenia's body and herbage. It's vulgar and verbal humour. Followed by similar behaviour to a Corinthian. Lysistrata asks if they miss their husbands because they're away. This is a plot inconsistency because, spoiler alert, but why would a sex boycott be effective if there are no men there with which to boycott the sex? So this is kind of just ignored. It's a comedy, so their plot inconsistencies are more common there, but it's just something to pick up on. Calanice, Marini, and Lampito all say that, where their husbands are. Calanice's is keeping an eye on our general on the Thracian coast. General Eucrates was considered incompetent, so this is a dig at him. They each say what they would do to put a stop to the war. Pawn this cloak of mine, cut myself in two, climb to the top of Mount Taygetum. That was 8,000 feet. So these are all, very hyperbolic, exaggerated examples of how much they want the war to end. Lysistrata tells them that they must renounce sex, to many gestures of disapproval and women turning to leave. The women say they'd rather do anything else but that, except for Lampito, who agrees. Lysistrata further describes her plan and then says, "In the words of Philocrates, you can always fall back on a dead dog," to reassure the women. So this is referring to a dildo. This is continually characterising the women as very sexual, and they can't go a minute without sex. So this is just a further vulgar humour. The women worry that the men will just beat and rape them, but Lysistrata says that there's no pleasure in sex if the women are just frigid. It is assumed that a man will rape his wife if she refuses sex. It's another nice insight into the life of Athenians. No man is ever going to get satisfaction if the woman doesn't choose that he should. They all agree to her plan, and she then says that the older women will seize the Acropolis under the pretense of making sacrifices. This is important because all of the war funds were kept in Athena's temple on the Acropolis, and the men needed that to fight. They decide to make an oath. They try in a shield, then suggest a white stallion. Helen of Troy's suitors swore an oath over a stallion. Stallions are very rare, that if she were ever abducted, they would fight for her. And this was basically the basis of the entire Trojan War, which is chronicled in epic and mythology many a time. So this is just a reference to that, and kind of making, again, it's like a women, Helen of Troy is synonymous with female sexuality and badness, so this is again characterising the women as similar to her. They all want to down the wine, stereotyping the women as alcoholics again, and they begin to make the oath. Lysistrata using the language typical of a sacrifice. How well it flows. In this, Lysistrata is impersonating Lysimachie, who was a real-life famous priestess of Athena Polias. Her name means dissolver of battles, whilst Lysistrata's name means dissolver of armies, so it has been assumed that Lysistrata was kind of characterised around the image of Lysimachie, and this is seen again later in the play. This is parodying a sacrifice, and how well it flows is a good omen, so it's suggesting that their boycott is going to be successful. They all hold the cup and make the oath that they will not have sex with their husband or lover. This is using very formulaic language. I will never willingly yield myself to him. I will submit passively and will not thrust back. I will not adopt the lioness on a cheese grater position. At this point, the parody has degenerated into farce, and it's very vulgar humour. You can look that up if you want to, but it's very graphic. As they drink the wine, they hear a shout of triumph and realise that the citadel of Athena is now in the women's hands. So the skene, which is the essentially the scenery on the stage, now represents the Acropolis rather than the house where they were outside first. So this phrase is symbolising that to tell the audience where they now are. They then go onto the Acropolis to join the others, except for Lampita, who returns to Sparta to tell the men of their oath. The chorus of old men comes on stage and sings about the women taking the Acropolis, using verse metre. They call Lysistrata Lyson's wicked wife. She was a notorious adulteress, which means she was a criminal, so they are criminalising Lysistrata because of her part in this oath. And they talk about when they overthrew Cleomenes. He was the king of Sparta who supported an oligarchical coup in Athens in 508 BC, likening the women to an oligarchy, sorry. This is also a topical allusion, but not really, because it was 97 years old, and this is also very funny because clearly the men in the chorus, even though they're old, would not have been that old. So it's both a dig at their age and also a show at their sort of conservatism and hanging on to their history. The men struggle to get up the Acropolis, which is visual humour, with their logs and coal pot. They blow on the live coals and intend to smoke the women out, and then they sing about this. The chorus of old women, led by Stratilis, arrive. Stratilis is a very old, elderly woman, and her name literally means Mrs. War because strat is Greek for military. The women bring with them pitchers of water and refer to Athena with her epithet, child of the lake. Stratilis and the men's leader meet and exchange insults. This is old people fighting, so it's very funny. someone ought to give them a bupulus or two on the jaw. Bupulus was an enemy of the poet Hippolytus, who wrote that he was going to punch Bupulus in the eye, so this name became synonymous with punching. No other bitch will ever grab your bollocks again, and Euripides was right. There is no beast so shameless as a woman. It's unclear what this is quoting. No one's really been able to find the Euripides play or whatever he's quoting, but Euripides is often called a woman hater, so it's not unsurprising. Stratilis tells him that he's not on jury now. The only place where old men had any power was on a jury. They were typically 501 men and paid 2 obols. The women fling their water over the men, putting out the flames. This is a literary contrast between fire and water, men and women, old and young. A magistrate and 4 policemen arrive, and he represents the Prubulos, which was like a war council during the war with Sparta, Peloponnesian War. He talks about Adonis, the Sicilian expedition of 415 BC, and the women's impotent behaviour. This was a failed expedition during the Peloponnesian War. After a festival to Adonis, he was a beautiful mortal, loved by Aphrodite, and died young. So that's just a bit of context about that. Again, this is all topical allusions that the audience at the time would have understood. He then makes a long speech about how the men pander to women's vices. They plan to crowbar the Acropolis doors open. Lysistrata emerges, and each policeman is told to tie her hands up, but then each one is threatened by either an older woman or a different woman, and hesitates. The older woman swears. It's very unusual for women to swear when addressing men, even in a comedy where swearing was common. So Aristophanes is kind of pushing boundaries here. The policemen regroup and try to advance on the Acropolis, but squads of old women come out and attack the 4 policemen until they are completely defeated and run away. This is visual humour and farce. They continue arguing about the strength of women and men, and then finally the magistrate asks why the women have taken the Acropolis. This is quite amusing because he should have asked this a long time before. He's typically a bit thick, or doddery. I don't mean to be political, but I saw a recent modern version of this, and they characterised the magistrate as Boris Johnson, so that you get the vibe from there. Lysistrata says that they took it to protect the money that would be used on war. The magistrate says that war isn't to do with money, but Lysistrata argues that Pisander and other office seekers start wars simply to steal public funds. Pisander had a record as a demagogue who used war for corrupt motives. So yeah, he is literally a war profiteer. So she's calling the government in charge of the Peloponnesian War profiteers. They further argue about the use of money for war. Lysistrata talks about how wives have to listen to men's diplomatic failures, such as the peace treaty of Nicaea, and silently accept. If they attempt to advise, they will be shot down. This was a treaty of 421 BC, and in 419/418 BC, we're not entirely sure, the Athenian assembly decided to add, the Spartans have not kept their oath. So it was a very short-lived peace, and it represents the diplomatic failure of the men in the Peloponnesian War so far. Let war be the care of menfolk. This is a quote from Homer's Iliad, Book 6, and it is Hector speaking to Andromache. It's unusual that they use this quote because Hector and Andromache are typically known as like a very loving couple, the epitome of a happy marriage. He does say this to her, but it's in quite a loving context. So either Aristophanes is using this to sort of contrast to say that men, should love their wives, or he's literally just quoting it because it fits. So that's something to consider. She suggests a deal. The men listen to the women, and then they'll set the men to rights. This is surreal humour in that time because obviously it was patriarchy, very sexist society, so the idea of men listening to women would have been ridiculous to the audience. The magistrate is horrified to be told what to do by a woman in a veil. "Let me die." He's very hyperbolic here, which is amusing just because of the ridiculousness of it. In response, Lysistrata takes off her veil, puts it onto his head, and the first old woman gives him her work basket. This is visual humour. The women verbally keep up this humour of treating him like a woman. For example, they say, "Chew beans and card wool all day." And her silence is even more amusing. They say that they will deal with the war. Chewing beans was a common practice amongst peasant women when engaged in monotonous tasks. Stratilis calls all of the mothers and grannies to battle. This is farcical because both mothers and grannies would be considered to be too weak to fight. Lysistrata uses mythical references such as Aphrodite and Eros to say that as long as the gods make people desire sex, this plan will succeed, and they will be known as liquidators of war. In Greek, this would be using the plural of the word lysimachie, so this is again keeping up this idea that Lysistrata was based off of Lysimachie, this priestess of Athenopolis. Lysistrata says she will stop people from going shopping in the marketplace in full armour, like Corybantes. And the magistrate says that's what brave men should do, always be prepared to fight. So this is satire on day-to-day life. So Corybantes were minor divinities linked to ecstatic dancing. It is highly likely that Aristophanes actually means Curetes, who danced in armour around baby Zeus in mythology. This fits more with the story, but he said Corybantes, so could take that in some way. They argue about it, and Lysistrata compares these men to King Tereus. He was a soldier in the Thracian army in one of Sophocles' plays. The magistrate asks how she plans to deal with the current conflict, and she uses a wool metaphor. This is basically the crux of the play. She's using feminine activities to sort out men's problems, which is kind of the point. So the war must be gradually unpicked until it unravels completely. You could run a whole city based on this idea. The citizen body is a raw fleece, and you have to beat out the villains and pick out the burrs, then deal with the knots of factionalism. You put all of the wool in the work basket of civic goodwill, including the immigrants, those in debts, colonies of Athens, and ball them into one big ball of wool. The colonies of Athens is, so the Ionic-speaking states rebelled under Athens' rule, and she wants to bring them back and give them Greek status, and she thinks that this will help them win because they will have more manpower and people will actually want to fight because they'll have a vested interest in the polis. The magistrate doesn't understand, so as I said, he's characterised as being a bit thick, and thinks she's being literal. He asks what women have ever done for the war effort, and she says that they have given sons to fight, and that there will be a lost generation of young women who could not marry because there are no men to marry, and by the time the war is over, they will be too old, and so they will just never have had the chance to marry and have children. This is a female sell-by date issue. So Aristotle is actually kind of pioneering female issues here, which is very interesting in that society. And the magistrate says, men grow old too. She says, old men can still marry young women and reproduce, but a woman's bloom is short, and before long she'll be alone and sad. This scene is the parabasis, so the serious points of the play have been made. The unity of Greek states, the female sell-by date, end the war, and now this marks a change in style. So after this point, the humour is much lighter, a bit more ridiculous, and less serious. During the oncoming song, the magistrate is dressed as a corpse, ready for the grave, and the women adorn him with their own clothes and jewellery. They make fun of his elderliness, saying that they'll make him a nice honey cake and that he'll make Sharon late. This is the only surviving reference to the Greek custom of burying the dead with a honey cake in their hand, and Sharon even was the ferryman of the dead in Hades. The magistrate angrily leaves, and the women shout out one last taunt about post-funeral offerings before returning to the Acropolis. This is, you just gave offerings third day after the funeral, so it's all death references, characterising him as old and near to the grave. The two choruses face each other, either side of the stage. The men strip, which is visual humour. They compare the women to Hippias, who was a very famous oligarchic dictator of Athens. People rebelled against him when he occupied the Acropolis in 513 BC. So this is again calling the women oligarchies and dictators and things. They say that they have colluded with the Spartans through Cleisthenes, and that they are trying to steal the jury fees, because getting rid of the jury is getting rid of democracy, so that's tyranny. Cleisthenes was an effeminate man, so he bridges the gap between men and women. And the jury fees, I've already mentioned, 500 men, 2 obols pay. They talk about how they will fight this tyranny. This is visual humour because these old men strike heroic poses which are typical of the young, like they fought Hippias. This is ironic because the Hippias incident was 80 years before this play, so these men certainly would not have actually been there. This is very similar to the earlier reference to that. The leader threatens to punch Stratilis. The women then also strip to address the audience, which is more visual humour. They say that they will give the city advice, then talk through every way in which women, this is really only referring to women from wealthy families, contribute to the city. Child priestess on the Acropolis, a grinder, ritual performance in the festival of Boronia, carrying the basket at the Panathenaea, etc. So these are all religious ideas. Grinder was a young girl would grind flour for a cake for Demeter. The Boronia was a festival held for Artemis. Girls aged 10 wore a saffron gown, then stripped and were nude for the majority of the ritual, and then put on long white robes of women. And the Panathenaea was a festival where young virgins carried the sacrificial basket, which held the knife for the sacrifice. Stratilis says that her advice is wise despite her gender. She is a full member of society, and she produces men as her contribution. What do the men pay? They've squandered the money that they won during the Persian Wars, and are living on tax. The men have ruined the economy. The cash reserve was so low during the Peloponnesian War that the state increased taxation, so this isn't a positive idea for the economy, really. She raises her leg as if to kick the men's leader. Visual humour and slapstick. The men are angry, and say that they must smell like men, which is strong stereotyping, and strip even further. They repeat their comments about Hippias, and then they say that if they follow the women with this, they will take over every manly art, such as building ships and in war like Artemisia. So this is clearly the type of thing that the men were scared of. It was a degree of insecurity in this society. And Artemisia was the queen of Halicarnassus, I think that's how you say it. So she took control of a squadron with Circes, and so she's known as this fighting woman. And the men are insecure about that, and they don't want their women to become like her. They talk about Myson's paintings and the Amazons, and then the leader makes as if to seize Stratilis, but she easily evades him. This could be referring to one of 2 murals of the Athenians versus the Amazons. The Amazons were famous female fighters, very physically strong, again, like the Queen of Halicarnassus. This is another reference to women showing military prowess. Stratilis says that if he gets her hangry, she will tear out his hair. The literal translation of this was shear you like a sheep, which is a dig about his age. So he's so old that his hair is like a sheep's. She says, let's smell like women, so imitating the men's leader, and then the women strip even further. They threaten any man who lays a hand on them. You will never more eat celery. This could be celery or garlic, but basically it means knock out your teeth so you can't bite. I'll smash your eggs in rage, like the beetle in the fable. It's referring to the testicles, and there was a children's story in which a beetle smashed eggs. So this is all things, again, that the audience would have been aware of. Stratilis says that the men's government is stupid and ineffectual. You cannot stop us, though you pass your motions 6 times o'er. She says that she invited some friends round yesterday to have a feast on a Boeotian eel, but thanks to the government decrees, they couldn't eat it. Boeotian eels were a forbidden import because Boeotia was an ally of Sparta. So this is just referring to sort of how far this war has extended into the day-to-day lives of the Athenians. She asks if they will ever stop this, unless she breaks his leg. She goes to seize his leg, and he evades her grasp with difficulty. Small slapstick humour. The men accept temporary defeat and move away from the Acropolis, while the women move closer to the gates. Lysistrata comes out of the gates and paces anxiously. This is parodying a tragedy. Stratilis and Lysistrata engage in a conversation that parodies tragedy. So they use tragic verse meter and tragic diction. They talk about women's fickle, cowardly thoughts and deeds, and spend time using archaic language. This is recitative, sung dialogue. The parody is then immediately stopped, and Lysistrata explains that they need a fuck. So this sudden change from a parody to more normal speech adds to the comic value, and this sort of swearing is shocking for a woman to swear like this, even in comedy. Lysistrata explains that she is struggling to keep the women to their oath. They are deserting right and left. She got one opening up a hole in the wall. This is double entendre. Another was letting herself down on a pulley cable. This is relevant because there was building work on the Acropolis, so there was actually a pulley cable there, like a crane, essentially. Another was about to fly to Orsilochus's place on Sparrowback. Orsilochus was a famous brothel owner, and Sparrowback has erotic connotations. These are all quite sexual excuses for leaving the Acropolis. A woman comes out of the Acropolis, trying to go home, to spread her fleeces on the bed to stop the moths from eating them. But Lysistrata replies, "You're not spreading anything on the bed," which is another double entendre. A second woman comes out, wanting to peel the bark of her flax and strip it bare. This is another innuendo, and Lysistrata basically responds in a similar way. A third woman comes out, crying to Aletheia to wait until she's off sacred ground. She was the goddess of childbirth, and it was considered bad to give birth on sacred ground. She claims to be pregnant, and Lysistrata exclaims that she wasn't even pregnant yesterday. Lysistrata pokes her stomach and says that it is rather hard for a baby. The woman says that it must be a boy, because boys were strong and tough and virile in this stereotype. But then Lysistrata lifts up her dress to reveal the large bronze helmet of Athena Promachos. This is very, very visual humour, because this would have been colossal. Like, it would not have been able to fit under a dress. It's just ridiculous. Athena Promachos was a large statue on the Acropolis of Athena in armour. Athena Promachos is Athena in her war state, essentially. The woman says that she has the helmet in case she has the baby before getting off the Acropolis. I'm really sorry I said getting off the Acropolis. I do apologise, I just do not have time to change that now. She can nest in it, so this is surreal humour and it's descended into farce. Lysistrata says that this is nonsense, and tells her to remain until the helmet has been carried round the hearth. 5 days after birth, babies would be walked around the hearth to introduce them to Hestia, and who's the goddess of the hearth, and the family, because so many died in childbirth, so they do it 5 days after. And this was called the Amphidromia. So Lysistrata is, parodying this, saying that the helmet is her baby. The woman says that she saw the guardian serpent and so can't sleep in the Acropolis anymore. There was a rumour of this big snake in the Temple of Athena, but it was never actually seen, so it was just a kind of myth or story that they told. The second woman agrees and says that the owls never let her sleep. Owls were the animal of Athena, just as a point. Lysistrata tells them to stop lying. She says that the men are just as miserable, and so they won't have to endure it much longer. She reads an oracle that they will triumph as long as they have solidarity. This is funny because during the Peloponnesian War, politicians used oracles as justification for their actions, so it's almost like Lysistrata is acting like a war politician. And this is also a parody. She reads the oracle. When that the swallows escape from the hoopoes and gather together, keeping away from the cockbird, then trouble and sorrow will perish. Zeus will make high into low. But if the swallows rebel and fly from the sacred enclosure, then 'twill be patent to all that there's no bird that's so nymphomaniac. So let's look into this. Swallows, this was slang for a vagina, and in this context it's referring to the female bird. Hoopoes or hoopos There was a myth of Tereus, who was turned into a hoopoe and had to chase a nightingale, but never to catch her. Cockbird could mean penis, but also in this sense refers to the male bird. So they're saying that if the swallows keep away from the, so if the women keep away from the men, essentially. Then nymphomaniac is sex obsessed. So basically, it's very unlikely this actually was a prophecy. She's probably making it up, but she's imitating the way that the politicians made up or interpreted oracles to their own benefit. This convinces the other women to persevere, and they return to the Acropolis. The two choruses confront each other. The two choruses, one is of the old men and one is of the old women. The men sing about Melanion, saying, "He fled from women and marriage into isolation. He was wise, and the men shall follow in his hatred." There's a myth of Melanion. Atalanta's father in Arcadia said that any man who could beat his daughter running could marry her, but anyone who lost would die. Melanion dropped his golden balls on the ground so that she would bend to pick them up, and so he won, and he managed to marry her. So, in reality, this is a lie. He didn't hate women or flee from marriage. In fact, he ran in order to get married. So this is the men's chorus is selecting from the facts to make their point. The men's leader ironically goes to kiss Stratilis, and she says not until he gives up onions. He lifts his leg to kick her, and she laughs at his hairy bum. So this is visual humour. Now the women sing about Timon, a wandering man with a prickly beard born over fury. They say he hated men but adored women. Timon was the archetypal misanthrope, who probably did exist, and his name became synonymous with the hatred of mankind and a recluse. Again, matted hair and beard was prickly personality, etc. Again, what they've said is kind of a lie. It's a selection from the facts. He hated everyone, not just men. Like, obviously, he said, "I hate mankind," because that was how people spoke, but he meant he hated, humans rather than men as a gender. So again, the women are selecting from the myth what they want. Stratilis threatens to punch the men's leader, and he cringes. This is ironic. She asks if he'd prefer her to kick him, and he says that in doing that she would display her man bag. This is referring to her vulva. She says that at least women regularly singe their pubic hair with a lamp. This was how prostitutes behaved, so just as men's hairiness shows virility, hairlessness shows femininity. So it was considered slovenly for a woman not to do this. The chorus retire to opposite ends of the orchestra and redress, whilst Lysistrata appears and sees something which makes her cry in delight, causing several women to join her. She sees a man driven half mad by the mystic power of Aphrodite. Again, this is visual humour, and the women constantly evoke feminine gods in this. This is always a battle between femininity and masculinity. The other women can't see him, so she uses landmarks which the audience would be familiar with to point him out. In fact, in the theatre they're watching this, they would be able to see the Acropolis directly behind the theatre. So a lot of the things she's pointing out, they probably actually can see from where they're sitting. Marini realises that it is Kinesius, her husband. Again, this is a plot inconsistency because in line 102, Marini has said that her husband is away. But again, we just ignore this. Lysistrata tells her to tease him, but not to submit to his sexual advances. This is said in a very hyperbolic way. I'm not going to rewrite it down here, but she kind of goes on and on and on about it. Kinesius arrives as the women, excluding Lysistrata and Marini, return to the Acropolis. He is accompanied by a male slave, called Manes, carrying a baby. This is unusual. It adds to the humour. It's a bit like a manny, that we would now call it, a male nanny. This is surreal humour. So, again, a male nanny would have been surreal at those days. Lysistrata greets him using very militaristic language and tells him to go away. He retorts back that he needs to see Marini, so that here there is a small passage of sticomythia. She asks who he is, and he responds saying, Kinesius from Painidae. This is a pun, and it basically means Mr. Sex from Bangtown. So Aristophanes has designed his name to be a play on words in a sexual way. Lysistrata sarcastically gushes about how Marini is always talking about him, causing him to breathe more rapidly and curse. This is visual humour. He asks her to bring Marini, and she asks him to give her something. He gestures rudely, with visual humour again, and then throws her up a purse. Lysistrata goes to get Marini, and he calls for her to do it quickly, because he is in such pain and is permanently rigid. Marini appears on the ramparts, calling back to Lysistrata not to make her go out to Kinesius, because he doesn't want to be loved by her. He calls to her to come down, and she refuses, and then they have a small argument. He gets the baby to call to her, and says that surely she couldn't harden her heart to her baby, as it was 5 days since it had had a bath or suck. This is an innuendo, and this is emphasising the male domestic incompetence because he hasn't fed it or bathed it for 5 days. Marini feels like she has to come down. Kinesius says that absence certainly does make the heart grow fonder, because she looks a lot younger and playing hard to get makes him want her more. This line was actually missing in the text, so this translation has improvised it. So this might not actually have been what it said, but it's kind of following along the lines of how Kinesius is acting and feels. She comes down and cuddles and kisses the baby. He asks her why she is listening to other women, and then attempts to caress her, but she brushes him off. He says that their belongings, the goods we own together, are being ruined, and she says she doesn't care. This is more of a rhetorical statement because legally she couldn't own property. He asks her how long it was since she celebrated the secret rites of Aphrodite. This is insinuating that she is neglecting her duties as a wife and to the gods. She says that she will not come home until the men have reached a settlement and stopped the war, and she's very insistent. She says that she does love him, and he says that she should show it then, and she says not in front of the baby, so he tells Manners to take it home. Women in this society could reject sex if it was in front of a baby, because otherwise they would be treated literally as a common prostitute, which would have been disrespectful. So this was pretty much the only time that they could legitimately reject sex. She then proceeds to come up with numerous farcical ways as to why they cannot have sex. They can't do it on the Acropolis, which is holy ground, so he suggests Pan's Grotto. This is where Apollo raped Creusa and conceived Ion. She can't purify herself, and so he suggests the Clepsydra spring. It was a rule that men and women purified themselves after sex before entering religious ground. The Clepsydra spring was a spring near Pan's Grotto, and it was assumed that Pan didn't really care what happened in his property because he was, very sexual. And as you can see, he allowed these things to happen. So this would mean her breaking her oath, but he says he doesn't care. He wants to do it on the ground, but she goes to fetch a bed, and she says she doesn't think of little of him as that. She returns and then realises that they need a mattress. He disagrees, but then makes her kiss him before she goes to get it. She begins to undress, which is visual humour, and then realises that he needs a pillow. He calls it a Heracles' supper. This was a common comedic image of the view that Heracles ate a lot, so it's saying that she's getting more and more things, very in an almost greedy way. She returns with the pillow and then undresses further. She reminds him of his promise to make peace, and he says that Zeus can strike him down if he doesn't. She says he needs a blanket, and he says all he needs is a fuck. Hard swearing, so this is verbal and shocking humour. When she returns with the blanket, he gestures to his erect phallus and says that it happened a very long time ago. She says he needs some perfume, and he's getting very agitated by now. She returns with the scent and puts it on him, but it smells horrible. She says she brought the wrong one and goes to leave again. By this point, it's descended into farce because she just keeps coming and going, and it's clear that this is just a sort of comedic interlude. She returns with a bottle, and he compares it to his phallus, visual humour, and says he already has too much bottle. This is a pun. As you can see, it definitely is getting more and more ridiculous with the humour since the parabasis. She promises to sleep with him and not to bring anything more, then reminds him of the peace, and then disappears as he reaches out for her. This is the farce. Dionysius sings about his struggle and calls for Philostratus to help him. "Hire a nurse for my young orphan prick." Philostratus was a famous pimp, and he was described as a fox dog, which means cunning and shameless. The men's chorus responds in pity. What heart, what soul, what bollocks could long endure this plight? Now, the Greek text had a much longer list than this, but this translation has adapted it just to 3. The men blame the women, which is casual sexism. Dionysius calls Myrrhine a villain and asks Zeus to catch her in a whirlwind, then let her fall to the ground and land with her legs spread so that he can shag her. This is ridiculous, surreal humour. A Spartan herald arrives with a curious bulge, visual humour, under his cloak. He asks for the Athenian Senate or executive. This was a council of elders advised the Spartan king, which was called a gerotha. So this is pointing out that Athens doesn't have this. It's the oligarchy of Sparta versus the democracy of Athens. It's not really a dig, it's just pointing out the differences. Dionysius teases his erect phallus, and the herald pretends that he doesn't have one, but then accidentally reveals it from his cloak. The herald calls it a Spartan walking stick. This is amusing because Spartans had a distinctive walking stick with a knobbly head. The herald talks of the bad situation in Sparta and says that they don't have Pellene. This was an ally of Sparta. It's likely it had some sort of double entendre, but we don't really know why. The herald says that all of the men are walking round town stooped over, as if they were carrying lamps. Old man did carry lamps, and they bent over it to protect the flame. So they're stooping over to cover up their erections. And he says that the women won't let them touch their wee berries. This is the clitorises. Dionysius understands that it isn't just the Athenian women withholding sex, and he tells the herald to send delegates with full powers to negotiate for peace. The 2 men depart in opposite directions, and the 2 choruses return to the centre, the women carrying the men's clothes. This is visual humour. The men's leader calls women stubborn beasts, and the women say that it is silly to keep fighting them then. Stratilis says that the men look stupid unclothed. It was disgraceful for old men to be seen naked. They aren't glorious like young men in statues. So she returns the clothes. They look more like men clothed. There is a spoof where Stratilis scoops a gnat out of the men's leader's eye. This is again visual humour. Each of the women kisses one of the men to tease them, and the men repeat the traditional proverb, "We can't live with you, we can't live without you." This is known as the misogynist dilemma. The men say that they ought to make peace, and then the choruses unite. This is peace between the men and women, foreshadowing the peace between Athens and Sparta. The united chorus mirrors the pathos of a tragic chorus, and invites the audience to forget about the troubles because peace is coming. The chorus offer the audience 200 drachmas, and then say that this will be a loan. This was very hyperbolic. 200 drachmas would have been enough for a family to live for 6 months. The theme of this united chorus, they keep doing this, is to offer a generous gift or favour, and then say that there is a condition. This is probably satirising the broken promises of the Peace of Nicaeus. The chorus say that they are having friends over from Charistus tonight. This is a pun on the word carrier, which is testicle, and Charistus was also an ally of Athens, and they had a rep for sexual activity. The food will be a young porker whose flesh will be good and tender and nice. This is ambiguous language to suggest a female. It's like a sex feast. The chorus invite the audience to this meal, reminding them to bathe. This was custom before an event or meal. And then say that the door will be shut in their face. It's continuing the aforementioned theme or trope. A party of Spartan delegates arrives, with the familiar erection. The leader comments on the long beards of the Spartans and says that you'd think they were carrying a pig cage. Long beards was typical of Sparta, and their phalli make it look like they're carrying pig cages under their cloak. The Spartans then drop their cloaks to reveal their erections. A party of Athenian delegates arrives on the other side of the leader, and the 2 sets of delegates don't see each other. The leader comments on the true-born Athenians, leaning forward like wrestlers, suffering from excess abdominal fluid. This is referring to the idea that the Athenians didn't migrate into Greece like everyone else. It's not true, but it's what they believed. This is visual humour, so they're hunched over to conceal their phalli. They keep hunching over. And excess abdominal fluid is the dropsy illness, so it's another joke about their erection/posture. The first Athenian asks where Lysistrata is because the men need to sort their issue out. The Athenians then drop their cloaks like the Spartan. This is against usual etiquette to refer to a respectable woman by name in public, so they're kind of degenerating from seeing her as a woman and more to seeing her as a human, a person who's orchestrated something big. The Athenians say that if they don't make peace soon, they'll end up shagging Cleisthenes. So this is again the effeminate man that was mentioned before. This is the only reference in the play to other ways that men could have sex. So they could have had homosexual sex, which wasn't uncommon in ancient Greece. It wouldn't have been particularly shocking. They also could have gone to brothels, because it's unlikely that prostitutes would have been keeping up with the sex strike. But again, these means are kind of ignored to keep up the plot. The leader tells the men to put back on their cloaks so that their sacred emblems aren't mutilated. So the penis on many of the statues of Hermes had been chopped off before the Sicilian disaster, and it was believed to be Alcibiades who did this. It also called the Clipper family, which is, I think, quite an amusing name for the group who do this. The Athenians and the Spartans finally notice each other after their cloaks are back on. They now share a bond of erections. An Athenian asks for straight talking, asking why the Spartans are there. This was a tragic method, so typically after deception there became truth, which led to a resolution. The Spartans say they've come to make peace. They prepare to call Lysistrata, or Lysistratus, but then she appears. This is a play on her name, suggesting that she is masculine. And actually Lysistratus was a common name. There was one particular Lysistratus known for his homosexuality, so this just kind of continues the idea that she's kind of verging on between men and women, because homosexuals were kind of seen as not transgender, but not fully men and not women in those days. The chorus sing and praise her as a brave woman with lots of compliments, and say that everyone now wants to make peace. She makes a long speech, calling on reconciliation, a naked young woman. This would have been very visually funny, because it would have actually been a male actor, wearing tights with fake breasts, and emphatically grotesque. In many ways, they might have chosen a particularly large and ugly man in order to increase this humour. She tells reconciliation to lead the Spartans gently, by the tool if necessary, to her. This is hinting at the lack of diplomatic finesse in the men. She then tells reconciliation to do the same with the Athenians. With the two sets of delegates either side of her, Lysistrata says that she may be a woman, but she is wise, and she listened to her father's conversations with older men. The start of this speech is adapted from and partly quoted from Euripides' Melanippe the Wise. Addressing the Athenians, she says that both polis worship the same gods and use the same lustral water. They were a single family in wars against the Persians, and yet now, when still threatened by the common enemy of Persia, they are fighting each other. Her message is, we are one Greece, we must all unite. She actually omits the fact that the Spartans were in peace talks with Persia at this time. So this is Aristophanes really getting across his message that they really need to unite because they have a bigger enemy against them. Addressing the Spartans, she reminds them of Pericleides sitting as a suppliant asking for help with the Helot revolt after Poseidon's earthquake, and how Cimon took 4,000 soldiers to help. In 465 BC, there was an earthquake which started the Helot revolt. Helots were very low class people in Sparta, and they had to pay about half of their produce to Sparta. So they revolted, and Periclides came to Athens asking for help, and the Athenians did actually help them. In fact, in reality, when the Athenians got there, the Spartans were too worried that they would jump upon the revolt and try and gain power, that they sent them back. But the point is that the Athenians were willing to help, is what Lysistrata is trying to say here. The Spartan agrees, but is distracted by reconciliation's bum. So this is keeping up the humour, it's very visual. Lysistrata then reminds the Athenians of how the Spartans saved them from slavery under Hippias. This was the tyrant that Sparta expelled from Athens. Again, Lysistrata omits the fact that the Spartans later tried to invade themselves. So in both of these examples, they've helped each other and then potentially could have destroyed each other, but she's only using the positive aspects of the examples. The Spartan calls Lysistrata noble, and the Athenian talks of reconciliation's vagina. This is vulgar humour, and he calls it pussy. She concludes they are each other's in debt, so they should... Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. She concludes that they are in each other's debt. Each in the other's debt. So they should make peace. I'm very sorry, I'm tired. During the next dialogue, the negotiators map out their demands upon reconciliation's body, which is visual humour. The Spartans ask for Pylos, a round hill, which is, so they indicate reconciliation's bum. In 425 BC, the Battle of Pylos is where Athens successfully took Pylos away from Sparta, so Sparta want it back. They say they've been probing around it for years, which is verbal humour. The Athenians try to protest this, but Lysistrata insists that they give it up. In return, the Athenians ask for the prickly bushes here, and the Malian Gulf behind them, and the long walls of Megara. There is a dramatic license here, because obviously the exact geography of this wouldn't match the female body, but it just works for comedic effect. The Spartans argue that they can't have everything, but Lysistrata pushes it through. Both the Athenians and Spartans say that they are ready for sex in equally crude ways. She says that there will be time for that, but they must discuss it with their allies in order to make a true peace. And the men say that their allies only want what they want, a fuck. So the allies will just agree. She concedes, but says that they must maintain purity whilst the women entertain them on the Acropolis with a feast. They must swear to a treaty, and then they can all go home with their wives. They each agree and hurry off to the Acropolis. The chorus offer the audience magnificent robes, gold jewellery, anything they need, and then say that they should look at the chests in which these items are given, because there won't really be anything there. This is continuing the maybe unusual theme of the chorus offering something and then taking it back, or saying that there's a catch to this agreement. Similarly, they offer wheat for bread making and then rescind the offer by saying that the dog will go for them. Wheat was better quality than the bread that poor people would have had, so it's quite a good offer. The Athenian delegates arrive, clearly drunk, bumping into the doorkeeper and Spartan slaves. They suggest that they should burn the slaves with their torch, and then say, a low-grade comic cliché that, though, I won't do it. This is breaking the fourth wall. It's the first time it's happened. Perhaps it's because they're drunk, or maybe it's Aristophanes coming to the end of the play. Then the audience protests, which is very pantomime-like humour, and the Athenians say that to please the audience they will do it. This is a weird interlude of kind of interaction with the audience, and it doesn't happen again, so it's just Aristophanes having a bit of fun, really. The Athenians brandish their torches at the Spartan slaves and tell them to leave unless they want to be set alight, and the slaves are driven away. An Athenian comments on how great the party is, and how the Spartans were actually quite fun. They discuss the pros of being drunk when making diplomacy, and the first Athenian talks about going to Sparta sober, and they don't hear what the Spartans do say and hunt for implications in what they don't say, bringing back wrong interpretations of the peace negotiations. So this is referring to an actual situation in 414 BC. There were peace negotiations in Sparta, but they went poorly. The delegates returned with contrasting reports. This time, drunk, they all get along well. If one of them starts singing Telemon when he should be singing Kletagora, all we do is applaud. Telamon and Clytogora are popular symposic songs, so it's a very party atmosphere in their diplomacy. The Spartan slaves return and are driven off again, and then the Spartan delegates come out of the Acropolis with their leader, carrying bagpipes. So throughout this translation, the Spartans have been characterised as Scottish, with Scottish dialect. This is predominantly to emphasise the culture difference between the Spartans and the Athenians, rather than to say that the Scottish is less civilised than whatever the Athenians are supposed to be characterised as. This is just to show the culture difference and the nationality difference. Even though they're both Greek, they have a national identity that's different. Also, the Greek definition of bagpipes is things expanded by puffing, which is an innuendo. The piper pipes a song, and the Spartan dances and sings in honour of the Athenians. The Spartan sings about the Spartan army, led by Leonidas in Thermopylae. So this is the final choral song, which is sung by a Spartan. And this demonstrates unity, peace, and shows the Spartans in a positive light, because Aristophanes has given them this final ending. The Spartan army led by Leonidas in Thermopylae, it was in 480 BC. If you've ever seen the film The 300, it's kind of shown there. Essentially, 300 Spartans fought 100,000 Persians. They all died, but it was a victory because they held their ground for quite a long time, so it was considered a victory in Sparta. This is a very selective speech because there are actually Athenians and other Greeks helping them. And also, it has been questioned whether it actually was only 300 men fighting 100,000 Persians. Herodotus is the historian who said this, and he is known for being more of not a factual historian. He tells the story, and it's likely that there would have been less Spartans than Persians, and it would have been a big difference, but perhaps not that big. But anyway, that's the story, so that's what they talk about. He then sings to Artemis to make the treaty fair and enduring. Lysistrata appears from the Acropolis wearing Athena's aegis, with other Athenian and Spartan women. The aegis is worn by Lysimache, and also people wore it before marriage, so it fits the scene and fits her character. Lysistrata begins talking and returning the women to their husbands, and says that they must all do a dance of thanksgiving. She says, this has now been attributed to the Master of Ceremonies, who is actually the Athenian delegate. Also, Lysistrata implies that earlier that her task is over. However, it is considered appropriate that she who separated the couple should bring them together. So some people say she shouldn't make the speech, but others say she should. Unlikely she actually did, but it fits here. They do so. They do the dance. In the song, they call to the Graces, Apollo, Artemis, Hera, Bacchus, and Zeus, also mentioning Aphrodite's peace of love. They don't mention Athena. The Graces were goddesses of beauty and delight, brought into the dance to imbue the dancers with grace and beauty. One interpretation is that Lysistrata actually represents Athena, in which case they don't mention her because Athena is already there in the form of Lysistrata, but this is just an interpretation. There is no evidence for that at all. The chorus dance pray for victory and exclaim, Evoi, Evoi, Evai, Evai. They play for victory in the tragic festival, so this is breaking the fourth wall again. It's not as much breaking the fourth wall because they're not talking to the audience, but it's just kind of putting the play in its actual context of being in a tragic festival and competition. Evoi, Evoi, Evai, Evai was associated with Bacchic worship. It's just an exclamation of exultation. Lysistrata asks the Spartan to sing again while they dance. He calls upon the muse of Laconia to sing about Castor and Pollux by Eurotas. These are mythological characters, look them up, they've got a very interesting story. And Eurotas was a river that flows by Sparta. He asks her to sing of Athena's temple and Apollo's noble seat, her being the muse. Apollo's noble seat is at Amyclae near Sparta. He talks of the Maenads' holy rods. Maenads are female worshippers of Dionysus, and they carried a thyros, which is a holy rod tipped with ivy, and Helen the Pure. So Helen of Troy was worshipped as a goddess in Sparta, unlike in Athens and most other Greek states. They all depart, and the chorus sing a hymn to Athena. The translation actually includes a paragraph of this hymn. It wasn't in the original text, but was created by this translator to demonstrate the hymn as they all depart, because they would have actually been singing something. Okay, well, thank you for watching. I hope this was very helpful. Leave any comments if you have any questions.